in the early days, there were I think there were about 28 or 30 people in the society, and mostly we had erudite deliveries from visiting academics or our own students who were crossing either in America or in London, or mostly London, or England generally, doing their PhDs. You couldn't do them here. It wasn't until about mid-60s, under the Parry report, no, that would have been earlier, a decade earlier, under that Parry report, there was a tremendous explosion in university life. And here, the constituent colleges all became separate universities, and of course later, soon after that, Waikato got underway. And they had much the same kind of courses, because in the early days you could go from one to start and then go to another for a bit and then to another quite happily. But then we had some internecine warfare with academics vying with each other to attract students and to make their own names. Some of them made their own names here before hopping back to safer, secure positions in universities abroad. But there were some very good characters around, like Ernest Beaglehall. He was the first professor of psychology, the only one. That was in 1947. He was appointed. And with the explosion in the mid-50s with that Parry report, there were more positions available. And sadly, they were filled with young Turks who thought that if you couldn't see it, listen, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it, it was of no consequence. So personality was out. And in came the operant conditioners and Isenkians and behaviour therapists who were going to clean up everything in a matter of bum, 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 and then prove it. I mean, bloody ridiculous. And also, they had no feeling at all for the so-called tender-minded side. You know, they called themselves the tough-minded psychologists, and the others were the tender-sided, and with whom I was very closely allied, may I say, even though I worked in the courts and then later in the prisons, because there comes a time when it's patently obvious that we aren't just physiological machines or mechanical machines functioning. We're more than that. But the people in psychology, there was friction there. In fact, it became so bad that when the British Psychological Society said, look, we're cutting off all the appendages, and we were an appendage like Australia and like Canada, and we set up the separate systems of our own. Then, of course, we had the kerfuffle about who's going to be a member and who's not going to be a member. And would you believe it? The Kiwis here, professors, came together down here in Willis Street and tried to exclude all education psychologists from the new society. I remember having quite a struggle there with them on this one, and every time I got up to speak, and it was interesting, the bells went dong, dong. It was the church across the road, of course, and I didn't pay the bell ringer a quid for the occasion, but it gave impetus to my opposition, and we won. The opposition was, but from that time onwards, the New Zealand Psychological Society had the strength of the community and for me had the strength of psychology, as in the early days the philosophy departments had them as well. And so ethics certainly came back into it, and there was some discussion in the early days as to whether the notion of the duty of a psychologist and the society was to be considered the needs of society and applied to try to strive to meet those needs. Rerum cognoscere causas et meliorum. I mean, there's a flavour there of the motto of the London School of Economics, with which I was concerned, I'm glad to say, because that's where I did my first academic work, and I built on it here. But that tension carried right through, and I think at the expense of a good many students. My next door neighbour, Jim Campbell, was a professor of mathematics, and he had women teachers on his class, the first teachers, and he couldn't understand why in psychology we put the hammering on stats. And he said some people are good at it, and they're also good at human relations, fine. But if they're no good at it, why not let them carry on with their strengths? And he didn't use it at all as a punishment, but sadly, some psychologists did. What else can I say? I suppose, for me, the society had meetings that I was so pleased to get to, because I found fellowship and camaraderie and goodwill and a discussion of applied problems, because, well, in my commitment in life was to try to do something to help people overcome obstacles with which they were imbued or were confronted, and in the process find out a bit more about myself. When psychologists who were in lonely output places could come and have an output and seek ways in which they could throw light upon the problem or problems in general that they saw. And then we could then try to work out some way of getting funds and giving them support to progress their own research. But it wasn't for research for the research sake. They would pick out people with whom they could research, and these would be people who didn't take the view that, well, here we are at the university, it's a bit like a well where we are plumbing the depths of the well, and if you want to come alongside us, come on, move your elbows and get in. Well, we don't care, and if you do, fine. If you don't, we don't care. So, I don't know, what can I say more than that? I don't know that I want to say much more than that. For me, it's been a challenging and an invigorating life's experience, and I've never had to shrink like some characters whom I know, who at the end of their careers in academia have confessed quietly to me their sadness and never, ever done anything to help people overcome problems. And to me, that's absolutely sad.